Hi, y'all. My name is Mina, and I am a modern psychological astrologer. And today in this video, I'll be talking about a topic that is really interesting and exciting to me called mundane astrology. I'll get into more of what mundane astrology is throughout this video, but basically, it is how astrology can be used to predict world events and to kind of give insight and descriptive language to what's happening on a collective level. So, what the kind of collective is thinking, feeling, focusing on, and experiencing based on the current placements of the planets and the current transits. So, to get started today, I want everyone to take a moment to ground themselves in reflecting on this question that I have up here. After the revolution, when all the battles are won, what will we be doing? So take a moment of silent reflection for yourself to answer this question. And the reason that I wanted to start with grounding us in this collective question is because as we talk today about how the transits and the archetypes of the planets show up for an effect, how we are all experiencing this kind of collective moment, really in world history and global history, of so much upheaval, of so much transformation and change, wanting to kind of ground all of us in thinking about what our vision is, which we'll really get into and talk more about throughout the video, what our vision is for kind of the collective as we move through and hopefully move through the other side of this particular moment in our collective history. So to get started on this topic of what is mundane astrology, just wanting to give kind of an explanation of it. Most people are probably really familiar with natal astrology. And so natal astrology is essentially taking the placement of the planets and the transits of the planets at the time of a specific person's birth and using the relationship between the planets at the time of someone's birth to come up with their personal psychological profile. However, the planets are always moving and they're changing signs and relationships to each other. And so, kind of, when people talk about like transits, like, the sun, for example, right now is in Pisces, transiting sun is in Pisces. They're talking about the movement of the planets, not at the time that somebody was born, which is what a natal chart is and what natal astrology is about. They're talking about kind of what's happening in the cosmos right now in this present moment and how it's affecting us in this moment. And so mundane astrology is using transits really at any given time. It could be in the present moment, it could be in the future, it could be, in a particular like moment in history that you want to think about or reflect on, but using planets to describe a collective societal or even global level events through the perspective of the planets and through the perspective of the archetypes of the planet. So you can see on the screen here, I have an example of a natal chart for Princess Diana. So this is the placement of the planets at the time of her birth. And this is kind of the chart that most people are familiar with when we talk about astrology, is what someone's sun sign, what someone's moon sign, someone's rising sign. It's where the planets were at the time of their birth and what they kind of say about that person's kind of individual psychological profile, their psycho-spiritual path of development, their karma in this lifetime. And on this slide is an example of the chart for today. So when I'm recording this video, it's March 15th, 2023. And so this is the placement of the planets today. So it's a chart for the present moment that I'm in right now. You can see that the sun is in Pisces, Mercury's in Pisces, you see Neptune in Pisces, Jupiter is in Aries, Venus is in Aries, you see Mars over here in Gemini. It's a very long transit that it's had through Gemini. You can see Pluto in its last few degrees of Capricorn before it moves into Aquarius, which we'll talk about a lot. And then today the moon is in Capricorn, maybe why I'm able to record this video, because I'm in a getting stuff done mood because the moon is in Capricorn. So current transits and what they mean and how they kind of affect all of us psychologically is really the topic of today's conversation and really what mundane astrology is about. So giving an overview of the planetary archetype, so what each planet symbolizes, what it means, what it represents. And I'll be talking about it both in terms of the natal chart, which I think a lot of people will be familiar with, what it means in an individual person's chart, the different planets, and then also talking about it in the context of mundane astrology. So what that planet means for the kind of larger collective experience in the context of like current or transits that you're looking at a particular moment. So the sun represents the hero's journey. It represents identity, ego formation, the protagonist of the story. Within mundane astrology, the sun could also represent shining a light. So an area of life or a theme of life, depending on transit or depending on aspects that the sun might be making to other planets, and depending on its sign, the areas of life or the themes in life that are where a light is being shined on, where there's a particular area of focus or emphasis. The moon within natal astrology represents one's emotional needs, feelings, relationship to mother, nurturing and care and belonging. Within mundane astrology, it represents kind of the changing moods, the day-to-day fluctuation of one's mood. So that's kind of the joke I was making in the previous slide about the moon being a Capricorn. And so I'm in a business mood right now, and I'm able to kind of do this video because I'm using that energy, and that's something that we could use transits to help us better utilize current energy that we're feeling in the moment to kind of use productively. So Mercury within the natal chart is communication, talking, writing, language, discrete information. I found based on kind of like observation and studying like transits and mundane astrology that Mercury represents the kind of information that we are receiving and the channels and ways in which we are receiving that information on a collective level. And so, you know, a really popular version, not a really popular version, but a really popular planetary phenomenon that a lot of people are familiar with is Mercury in retrograde. So taking a step back, if we think about what the planets are, if we think about what they do, I always say this, in astrology, planets are named after like deities, they're named after gods, Greco-Roman gods, and they do in fact have like personalities, and they do in fact have like goal agendas and like agency, and they do something. They control an area of life, and they want something to kind of happen in a particular way, in a particular area of life. And so we think of Mercury as ruling our systems of communication and ruling over kind of how we get information, how we transmit information, how we transmit shared or common understanding between each other. And we think of a retrograde, which we could get more into maybe in a later video. We think of a retrograde as a period of time when that planetary archetype is maybe taking a step back from its active role in the area of life that it controls. The Mercury retrograde is basically a time, it happens 3 times a year for about 3 weeks, 3 times a year. It's a time where the planetary archetype of Mercury, its ability to connect us to channels of communication. Mercury also controls like traveling between places, where those tools and technology and ways that we are able to communicate and ways that we are able to connect and ways that we're able to travel, the planetary archetype ruling over it kind of takes a step back, and it's not as active, and it's not participating in as engaged of a way. And that's when we start to see like our means of transportation and our means of communication and our means of connecting and getting information start to break down during Mercury retrograde, because it's that archetype of the planet Mercury that usually is very present and in control of these things, taking a step back and kind of not being as active in that part of our lives. So that's one example of how we can use like mundane astrology, what are the planets doing right now to better understand what's happening for us on a collective or social level. So moving on to another planet, Venus. So Venus rules beauty, relationships, attraction, affinity, love. I found, and we'll talk about this more because we have a Venus retrograde this year. Venus retrogrades every other year, and I've been reflecting on the last couple of Venus retrograde cycles. I found that Venus is our ability to connect with each other, like on a social, affective level. Mercury's connection, I think, more in like the information that we're able to transmit to each other. And Venus is more of our ability to kind of be together and bond and connect. And Venus by sign and the aspects that it's forming within mundane astrology when it's in its retrograde cycle, which we'll talk about more later in this video, can also point to what's happening for us collectively in terms of how we're able to connect to each other, socialize with each other, not be able to socialize or connect with each other. So Mars represents self-assertion, aggression, taking action. It's an archetype of the warrior. It also represents our sexuality. Mars within mundane astrology, similar to the sun, is very action-oriented. It's where our kind of energy, where our ambition, where our focus is directed toward, and where we're willing to put in effort and work to make something happen. So Jupiter represents the principle of expansion, our ideals, our highest philosophies, high religion, higher knowledge. It also represents kind of what we're receiving from the universe and without really asking for it, what's kind of just arriving to us in any moment. Jupiter is abundance. Sometimes, you know, if there's such a thing, overabundance, getting way more than we asked for, and there can be a shadow side to that, and that's what Jupiter can represent in the mundane on the collective level as well. Saturn is a principle of contraction, of restraint, of limitations, of oppression and boundedness, which these are terms, all of these terms really apply to both natal astrology, so what's happening on an individual level within our own natal charts, but also how Saturn affects us collectively as it moves through the signs and as it makes aspects to other planets, what we as a collective are feeling or experiencing and how we're feeling it and how we're experiencing it. Uranus represents the genius principle, revolutions, technology, breaking boundaries. Again, all these words are both apply to the natal context, and it can also apply to the mundane context. So Uranus is, I found, can be these moments where history kind of like really speeds up and we kind of have some sort of breakthrough collective realization, breakthrough technology, or breakthrough ideas about things that kind of advance us into like new eras or new epochs. Uranus can also represent the breaking away from traditions and the breaking away from kind of an old way of being. If that's its relationship to Saturn, both within the mythology between Saturn and Uranus, and also, you know, astronomically as well, that Saturn is the furthest planet that we can see with the naked eye without a telescope, and it's you know, the seventh planet in the kind of traditional seven celestial bodies, and Uranus is the first planet outside of the seven that we discovered outside of those traditional seven archetypes, and it's the first planet that we were able to see only with a telescope. So Uranus really coincides with like scientific advancement. And when humans discovered Uranus, it expanded the solar system, our understanding of the size of our solar system. It doubled it. So the solar system doubled with the discovery of Uranus. And so Uranus is really breaking past the limitations of our human consciousness that Saturn, I think, really represents, limitations of our human consciousness, and Uranus is really breaking past that. So Neptune is imaginations, dreams, nirvana, the spiritual, fantasy, illusion. Again, words that describe natally, and also within the mundane, our kind of collective dreams and imagination, our collective fantasies, our collective illusions, also the shadow side of Neptune, our collective delusions, our collective disillusion also is strongly correlated with Neptune and these kind of Neptune transits that we've been experiencing these last couple of years. And then finally, last but definitely not least, is Pluto. We've had some major kind of Pluto moments in the last couple of years. We'll have a major Pluto transit this year, a major kind of Pluto moment this year. Pluto represents death, destruction, rebirth, transformation, the phoenix rising, the underworld, traveling into the underworld, and all the mythology that kind of goes along with that. And again, describing it both natally and within the mundane, whatever Pluto touches, Pluto completely calls into question, completely transforms, completely unearths, and completely undermines as well. Kind of undermines, similar to Uranus and its relationship to Saturn. If Saturn is kind of what we can consciously understand our true limits, our true boundaries, our true kind of, our true limits, boundaries, or limitations, Pluto is like pushes that even more, right? It's kind of our limits and our boundaries that we don't even have a conscious understanding of, or even necessarily a conscious relationship to. So Pluto kind of turns up the stakes on everything that it touches. And we'll talk more about Pluto and kind of the upcoming Pluto transits. So just wanting to go over some of the major aspects that we've had in the last couple of years and what they have, major kind of global events that they have coincided with, and how the planetary archetypes that we just talked about help describe or help to illuminate some of these themes. So Saturn, Pluto, we had the global coronavirus pandemic, and Saturn, Pluto is really historically strongly associated with like disease and pandemic. And we saw that in 2020. In May of 2020, Jupiter conjuncted Pluto, and we had the global protest movements, Black Lives Matter, uprising, and some of the largest kind of protest movements in history happening all throughout 2020 and all over the world. December of 2020, we had the Jupiter-Saturn Great Conjunction, which Jupiter and Saturn conjunct every 20 years. Before 2020, they were conjuncting. They spent 200 years conjuncting only in Earth signs, and the Great Conjunction that happened December of 2020 started a 200-year cycle of Jupiter-Saturn conjuncting in air signs, which is really significant, especially because the sign that they conjuncted in is Aquarius, and we'll see that Aquarius keeps coming up as this really kind of important thematic thread through these moments that we're experiencing as a collective. And then January of 2021, Jupiter squared Uranus, and we had the insurgents in the United States. We had an insurgency that happened January 6th that coincided like almost exactly with this Jupiter-Uranus transit. And then all of 2021, we had Saturn and Uranus squaring each other, which a lot of astrologers were really excited about, or really looking forward to kind of understanding that relationship between having the Saturn-Pluto happen in 2020 and then having the Saturn-Uranus happening the year later. And I think that strongly coincided with a lot of things that I think touch on the themes of Saturn and Uranus and Aquarius, because Saturn was in Aquarius at the time. But I think it really was focusing, or really was highlighted by the global vaccination program, which I think really highlight both Saturn and Uranus themes. It was this really kind of breakthrough, very quickly developed vaccine, which is a very Uranus, and it was implemented by this kind of, by governments and kind of institutions of power and institutions of governance, which is very Saturn, who are more or less like forcing people to get vaccinated as a way to kind of push us past or push us through the Saturn-Pluto moment that we had the year before, which was a coronavirus. And I think there's kind of an interesting, which I'll talk more about, relationship between Saturn and Aquarius, and the way in which that response, or that kind of response, contrasts with then when Jupiter went into Pisces, and Jupiter-Uranus, or not Jupiter-Uranus, but Jupiter and Pisces as another specific kind of response to the pandemic. And the U.S. had its Pluto return. It hit exact February of last year, and that is significant for a lot of reasons that we will probably not get into in this video, but is interesting to know that also the U.S. has had this really significant astrological transit happen last year, which was its Pluto return. So looking ahead to the major transits of this year and taking a moment to discuss what they mean, what their potentials are, and what their possible relationships to the previous major transits that we just discussed could be. Starting with Saturn transiting out of Aquarius. It's been 2.5 years in Aquarius after the Great Conjunction, end of 2020, and it's moved on as of last week into Pisces, where it will spend another 2.5 years. it's also following Jupiter. Jupiter spent a year and a half in Pisces, now it's in Aries. And so it'll be interesting to see, if we think about the relationship between Jupiter and Saturn, what it is that Jupiter had kind of invited us into in the past year and a half, that Saturn, through its kind of its agenda and its tools of refining through challenges and refining through discipline and hard work, are going to invite us into now that it's in Pisces. A lot of astrologers predicted, and I feel like this ended up being true, that when Jupiter went into Pisces around summer of 2021, and it went back into Pisces again, beginning of 2022, a lot of astrologers predicted that that would be a more contagious strand of coronavirus. And I think in a lot of ways with Delta and Omicron, and then all the other strands of Omicron that we got, that ended up being true, that when Jupiter went into Pisces, it was a different phase of the pandemic where you know, we were kind of getting herd immunity. This is a little bit of what I was talking about of you know, Saturn Uranus, which was very much like, we're all going to get this vaccine. We're all going to act in a socially responsible way, which is what Aquarius asks us to do in order to move through this pandemic. And then when Jupiter kind of came in, and Jupiter doesn't really ask us to do anything that's too difficult, Jupiter brought in a more contagious strain in Pisces, and in its kind of domicile Pisces, brought in a more contagious strain, and in a lot of ways was moving into a different phase of the pandemic. Also, when Jupiter was in Pisces, it had its conjunction. It's like a 1 in a 150-year conjunction with Neptune in Pisces. Jupiter and Neptune are both rulers of Pisces. Jupiter is the traditional, and Neptune is the modern ruler of Pisces. And they were in the same sign, and they conjuncted last year. And that, I think, opened up this huge energetic portal, which I talk about a lot, of interest in kind of new age spirituality, alternative kind of healing practices and modalities, which I do think also has a really strong relationship with kind of the mass unwellness that we all are still very much experiencing, and definitely the height of it experienced in 2020 during the pandemic. And I also think the shadow side of that kind of Jupiter, Neptune, Piscean energy has been, you know, the spread of misinformation and disinformation, people's kind of willingness to believe a lot of things, maybe things that, you know, we shouldn't believe, conspiratorial thinking. Yeah, I think that's been kind of the shadow and the excess of Jupiter in Neptune and Pisces. And so maybe Saturn in Pisces will clean that up a little bit. We'll have us reckoning in some real way with the excess of Neptune and Pisces. Neptune has been in Pisces for quite some time now, and the kind of year and a half of kind of overflow of that energy that we had when Jupiter was in Pisces. Maybe Saturn, when it comes in, will clean that up and will ask us to really either, for me, I know that I'm experiencing this, get really serious about our spiritual practices and our and the kind of path that we want to walk in this healing work that we do, in this astrological work, for me, for example, that we do, and maybe on a collective and society level, it'll also be reckoning with some of the shadow sides of that excess, which have been, you know, the mass disillusionment, the mass kind of conspiratorial thinking, the mass kind of misinformation and disinformation, and how that has really kind of affected us on a collective level. So we'll see in the next 2.5 years what Saturn and Pisces will bring for us as a collective. So another major transit that's happening this year, hugely important transit, don't want to understate how major it is Pluto is transiting into Aquarius starting March 24th. Then it will leave Aquarius in June of this year, and then it will re-enter and kind of stay in Aquarius until 2043. So Pluto transits, Pluto has, of all the kind of 10 planetary bodies, has the longest transit. It spends the most time in a sign. Pluto signs mark, you know, the beginning of a new generation. So Pluto leaving Capricorn, where it has been since 2008, and going into Aquarius this year is a hugely major thing. Pluto, in whatever sign that it goes into, and by aspects to other planets, as I said earlier, really undermines everything that it touches, and it really kind of calls into question everything that we kind of believe to be true about something. And it asks us to do the deep work of transformation, of radical transformation. We've definitely seen that in the time that Pluto has spent in Capricorn. And so Capricorn, we'll talk about, Capricorn, and we'll talk about Aquarius, which are both Saturn-ruled signs. And Saturn in its Capricorn form is in its yin form, its earth form sign. And in its Capricorn form, Saturn really is kind of playing by the rules of society. Saturn understands how you win the game of life, how you succeed within the world as it is, and it plays those rules. However, Capricorn, or Saturn in its Aquarius form, Saturn in its yin form of Aquarius, isn't as interested in playing by the rules as is. Saturn in its Aquarius form is trying to rewrite the rules of society, is trying to itself establish new and more progressive, and by progressive, it can be what we, I think, in like the US context consider progressive, which is like left of center, like left of kind of liberalism, but more so like progressive in the sense that it's advancing a social vision of the world that currently doesn't exist, right? And that's kind of what yang energy is, like fire air energy is. It's really believing in and investing yourself in something that doesn't currently like exist in the material realm. And so Pluto moved into Capricorn in 2008, where there was a huge financial collapse, a huge global recession, and really kind of hit it off with a bang, right? In terms of the fundamental, calling into question the fundamental like structures and infrastructures of society. And that's Capricorn, is kind of those fundamental structures of society that we, really base our definition and our understanding of success on. Pluto went into Capricorn in 2008 and has really been doing its job of undermining all of that for the past few decades that it's been in that sign. Saturn moved into Capricorn in 2020, or it moved into Capricorn in 2018 and conjuncted Pluto in Capricorn in 2020. And that's when we really started to see the complete unwinding, I think, in the popular consciousness. And in some ways, that's the relationship that Capricorn had to, or the planets that were in transit Capricorn had to those planets in Pisces, the disillusionment, right? The Piscean disillusion that came from the complete unwinding and the fundamental like reevaluation that we really had to do of the structures of our society, of our governments, of our institutions, and what it really meant to succeed within those structures. And in some ways, that's also the expression of Uranus that moved into Taurus in 2018, which we'll talk about Uranus and Taurus. Uranus, again, is kind of a radical shaking up and a radical kind of reorientation. And it has been in Taurus, and Taurus is really strongly associated with material well-being, quality of life, comfort, and us having to really kind of radically shake things up for a lot of people in that area of life, and how all of these transits have kind of been working together to create kind of our current sense of reality. So Pluto will transit out of Capricorn, and it'll start a 20-something year, about a 20-year transit in Aquarius. And so Pluto in Capricorn was really fundamentally calling into question and radically deconstructing the rules of society as is. And we think about Aquarius as our ability, or our capacity to make social change. Essentially, that's what Aquarius is, to believe in and to make and to work toward a vision of social progress. Maybe when Pluto goes into Aquarius and spends the next 20 years in Aquarius, it will be radically redefining and radically deconstructing and radically calling into question what it is that our vision of social progress actually means and what it actually looks like. And I think it's been working really in this current moment in a really interesting way with that Uranus and Taurus transit, because Uranus and Taurus has been doing that, really shaking up for us, because that's what Uranus does. Uranus kind of walks into the room and shakes the table for us our deeply held values, which I think that values is kind of a Taurian word. It's a Venusian Taurian word. Our values about what it means to live a good life, to lead a comfortable life, and really our kind of financial security, which is also really strongly tied with Taurus as well. So May 17th, Jupiter will move into Taurus. So Jupiter is currently in Aries. It will move into Taurus on May 17th. And when it hits 0 degrees Taurus, Pluto will also be still at around 0 degrees Aquarius. So they will hit at 0 degrees, which is, you know, in astrology is very significant, that 0 degrees. They will hit a square with each other. And so Jupiter-Pluto moments have been particularly significant, I would say, for the global left in this country. Jupiter-Pluto was the uprisings that happened, the conjunction that happened in 2020. Jupiter and Pluto had kind of a minor relative term aspect last year that coincided with a lot of kind of global kind of leftist activist movements as well. And the square is less significant than the conjunction that happened in 2020 within astrological terms, less significant, but more significant than the sextiles that we had last year. And so I think that that May 17th date for folks who are kind of following global trends and global like movements for kind of social justice should really pay attention to, because Jupiter at exactly 0 degrees, right when Pluto is about to change signs and start a 20-year transit, is going to be hitting Pluto in a square at exactly 0 degrees. And we'll talk more about the signs and the significance of the signs, the Aquarius-Taurus relationship, and the other fixed signs in the next few slides, but also the degrees, not the degrees, but the signs that they're in that I think also will have a lot of significance as well. Also, as I've been saying this entire time, Uranus is in Taurus. It has been in Taurus since 2018. It spends about 7 years in a sign. Jupiter will go into Taurus and it will conjunct. So it'll hit a major aspect to Uranus next year in April 2024. But this year, this summer, it will get pretty close. It won't hit exact, but it'll get pretty close. And so I think some of the themes that come up in terms of Jupiter-Uranus this summer will really kind of come to full culmination next year. And so it's definitely worth talking about now and thinking about now. In the last couple of years, I've noticed that Jupiter-Uranus has been really strongly associated with far-right movements, particularly in the US, where, as I said, Jupiter-Pluto has been more left progressive movements. Jupiter-Uranus has been strongly coincided, I think, with far-right movements. And as I said, when the insurrection happened, it was a square between Jupiter-Uranus. The square is a slightly less major aspect than the conjunction. The conjunction is a more major aspect. And so I think those of us, again, who are tracking like global movements on the right, on the left, in the middle, what have you, should really be paying attention this summer to what's happening collectively and how those themes, particularly by sign, which we'll talk about on the next slide, of Taurus, which I've already talked about a little bit. Taurus associated with quality of life and kind of material well-being, financial well-being, and security, how those themes are coming up this year and what they could culminate into next year when we have that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. And the last major transit of this year that I am going to talk about is Venus going retrograde in Leo from August, the end of August or end of July, sorry, to September. And Venus does go retrograde about every 18 months or so. I think this one will be significant. I think all Venus retrogrades are significant, but this will be significant because of the sign that it's in Leo, and its relationship, which we'll talk about more in the next slide, its relationship to the other planets that Venus will be aspecting when it goes retrograde. It'll be aspecting Jupiter and Pluto and Uranus. The last 2 Venus retrograde cycles we had, again, were kind of during the pandemic years. We had Venus go retrograde in Gemini in 2020. And we had Venus go retrograde in Capricorn end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022. I think that's correct. Yes, in the beginning of 2022. And I think through my observations, kind of learned a lot about Venus and how she participates. I use gender terms when I talk about Venus, but how she participates in our kind of collective experience through these retrograde cycles and through the signs that they were in. So when Venus was a Gemini and went retrograde around April of 2020, it was that moment for me personally, and I think for a lot of people, like in the community that I was in, it was a moment in the pandemic where we realized that, oh, this is not going to be a 2-week like vacation. Like this is real-ish that we're going to experience, and it's going to last a really long time. And so you see those Venus themes of our ability to socialize, our ability to be together, our ability to see one another. And you see kind of the retrograde that I was talking about earlier of that not being as much of a thing anymore because of how the retrograde works. And you can see the Gemini theme of, because Mercury was also retrograde for a really long time at the beginning of the pandemic, which I think also had a lot to do with why we really were not getting accurate information about what was happening, and then it stationed direct, and then Venus went retrograde. But the Gemini ability to kind of communicate and transmit information, both that we are finally getting like the truth or real information about how serious this pandemic was, and also like we were scrambling at that time, I remember, to figure out like how are we going to stay in contact with people, like how are we going to communicate with people, how we need to check in with people, we need to know where people are. And so you see that Venus sociality being affected by our inability to be in person and trying to figure out how to communicate with each other, which is those Gemini themes. And so that was the Venus retrograde that happened in 2020. And then the Venus retrograde that happened in December of 2021, it coincided with Jupiter going into Pisces, and that was it was when Delta and Omicron were really taking off. We had this huge new wave of the pandemic, and a lot of things started to shut down, and we kind of went into this brief kind of shutdown mode again. And so again, there's Venus. Our ability to see each other in person and interact and socialize was curtailed, which is that retrograde. But I think our attitude about it and our orientation toward it was very different. And it was some of that Capricorn theme of like, okay, this is just what we have to do. Like, we know the drill, like we know how this goes, like we know how to move to Zoom, and we're going to stay here we're going to stay down for a couple of weeks, and that's just what we have to do. And that was a more kind of like the Capricorn themes of that Venus retrograde. And I think how Capricorn too archetypically works with Pisces, because Jupiter in Pisces at the time, where Pisces is just kind of spreading this virus all around and just, doing whatever. And Capricorn is kind of holding because this is the relationship between water and Earth, is Capricorn is kind of holding the container for the water to be able to take whatever shape and flow in whatever direction it wants to. And so our ability to kind of lock ourselves back down and be responsible in a Capricorn sense was the container through which this Jupiter in Pisces was really spreading this virus in a more contagious way throughout our society. So we'll talk more about the sign that Venus is in. Venus will be retrograde in Leo this year, and some of my ideas or what I think that might mean as it kind of hits these other planets and the themes that those other planets are going to be inviting us into this year. So as I said in the previous slide, I want to take some time to talk about the signs that have kind of come up a lot or have really been in high focus through these major transits that we've been talking about. Specifically the 4 fixed signs, which would be Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, notable in that it hasn't really been as highlighted, and Aquarius. And so as people might know, in astrology, there are 12 signs of the zodiac. Each sign has an element. There are 4 elements: water, air, fire, and earth. And each sign also has a modality, and there are 3 modalities. There is cardinal, fixed, and mutable. So 4 elements times 3 modalities equals 12 signs of the zodiac. So each sign in the zodiac has a unique combination of an element and of a modality. So the 4 signs I just mentioned are all fixed signs. So the 4 fixed signs in 4 different elements. Taurus is a fixed earth sign, Leo is a fixed fire sign, Scorpio is a fixed water sign, and Aquarius is a fixed air sign. And the 4 of them together make what's called, I think I have animations on the slide. This is the cardinal cross, which are 4 signs: Aries, Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn. These are the fixed signs, which I'll talk more about, which are Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius. And then these are the mutable signs, which are Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. So we'll be talking about the fixed, the fixed signs and the fixed cross. So all of the fixed signs kind of have certain things in common based on their fixed modality, and then obviously some major differences based on their different elements. But all the fixed signs are security oriented. All of the fixed signs, their kind of style, the way that they express is that they address crisis through stabilization, right? So while other signs may be more action oriented, the fixed signs are more stabilization. They're conservative signs, not conservative in like what we would call conservative politics, but conservative in the sense of their energetic flow is about keeping and holding on to what you have and really staying on it, and resource gathering and like holding on to things. The shadow of the fixed signs can be that they're rigid, stubborn, or stuck in place. The high resonant form of the fixed signs can be that they are steadfast, committed, and they express in a full-bodied way, right? They are the full kind of, in each element, the fixed signs are like the fullest expression, fullest kind of culmination of that element. So talking more about each of the 4 fixed signs and what they represent and what they kind of aim to do, how they express themselves. If we start with Taurus, which is an earth sign, Taurus is focused on material security through resource gathering. And so if we think about that theme, which I think is a really important theme to hold on to throughout our reflection on the current transits, as how are these signs asking us to move through crisis through stabilization? We start with Taurus, which is an earth sign. Taurus wants to move through crisis by stabilizing materially and through resource gathering. And if we think about the planets that have been in Taurus, Uranus and their archetypes and what they mean within the mundane. If we start with Uranus like shakes things up, right? Uranus comes into the room and starts shaking the table. So we think about Uranus in Taurus. Uranus is really shaking up our ability to and our relationship to material security, our ability to achieve material security, our ability to get the resources, the baseline material resources that we need, which is what Taurus is really focused on. And then if we think about this Jupiter transit that will happen in May, where Jupiter goes into Taurus, and we think about the themes of Jupiter, which is this kind of expansion and this kind of opening up and this kind of opportunity through overabundance in a sign that is about abundance, Taurus. It'll be interesting to see how Jupiter, what Jupiter has to offer us following what Uranus has been kind of doing to our ability to gain material resources and material security, and then what will happen when those 2 planets conjunct next year in Taurus. Then the next fixed sign is Leo, which is a fixed fire sign. And Leo is security through identity formation. And identity formation, as Leo would define it, is recognition of one's own uniqueness, one's own specialness, and one's own unique contributions and talents to the world. And Venus, when it goes retrograde, will go retrograde in Leo, and it will be aspecting Jupiter by square. It will be aspecting Uranus by square, and it will be, I think it will be briefly, not when it's retrograde, but briefly aspecting Pluto in Aquarius. And so thinking about how Leo is, and the Leo themes that we've had in the last couple of years really is kind of obsessed with, and obsession is a fixed word, obsessed with. All of the fixed signs have obsessions, right? With kind of, I need to be recognized, I need to be special, I need to be seen, I need to be heard, I need to be adored, I need to have fans. And how in some ways, we'll talk about when we talk about Aquarius, in some ways we've been living in, especially like since the pandemic, in a very Aquarian times. Saturn went into, the Great Conjunction happened in Aquarius. Saturn went into Aquarius for 2.5 years. Now Pluto's going to go into Aquarius for 20 years. And Aquarius is very much like, you have to put yourself aside and do, especially the Saturnian nature of Aquarius that a lot of people don't understand. You have to really do what's hard and what you don't want to do for the larger collective well-being. And so I think we've kind of been living in excessively Aquarian times. What happens when you have an excess of one sign is that you either can consciously balance it with its opposite sign in order to kind of have a high resonant version of both signs, which we'll talk about in the next slide, or the shadow of that sign starts to come out in these really grotesque and these really excessive ways in order to try and balance within the collective the excess of another sign. And so Leo, one way that I think this has really kind of shown up within the mundane, so within the kind of larger social collective world, is one expression of Leo is this idea of like the one true king, the archetype of the one true king, right? The one rightful king who is supposed to take his place on the throne, who will restore the kingdom to glory, to greatness, right? In opposition to Aquarius, which is very much like egalitarian, everybody's the same, everybody's equal, it's very democratic, like that's kind of Aquarius. And so you can see in our social collective this real teeter-tottering balance between the Aquarian values that we've really all had to live with in the past 2 years of like, this is what's good for the collective, this is what's good for society, this is what's going to advance, egalitarian principles. And then this kind of less conscious in some ways manifestation of this Leo need to find the one true king and find that one kind of special sparkling figure that's going to restore us to this kind of great sparkling vision, and how that's played out, right? That dynamic that we're seeing in our collective. Take two. So moving to Scorpio. So Scorpio is a fixed water sign, and Scorpio wants security through emotional attachment and through bonding. So security through also emotional dependence. And one interesting thing about Scorpio is in terms of major transits that we've had in the last few years, there really hasn't been much activity in terms of planets going through Scorpio, besides obviously the sun that transits through Scorpio every year, Venus that has, a shorter transit, Mercury as well, and Mars. But in terms of these major outer planet transits, we haven't had a lot going on in Scorpio. We also haven't had a lot going on in Leo, but I talked a bit about like what that shadow side of Leo has looked like. And when I think of the shadow side of Scorpio within the mundane and how it has shown up like within our collective, I think a lot about how, and this is the square relationship between Aquarius and between Aquarius and Scorpio. Aquarius and Scorpio are squaring each other, which means they have something in common, but they also have something that's fundamentally different, and that causes like real tension. And I think of Scorpio and Aquarius, they're both collective minded, they're both group minded, but Scorpio is much more about the emotional and relational, is much more about the relationships between people. That's a bit of its like resonance with Leo, the other side that it squares. It's much more about the relationships between people and people's kind of emotional well-being within those relationships. Versus Aquarius is much more about like the larger social project that the collective is like the instrument or the tool of achieving. And I think that, again, we've been living in these kind of excessively Aquarian times. Not necessarily a bad thing, just the reality, with some hard planets moving through Aquarius, Saturn, Pluto, right? That people, like the irony, I think, of the last few years is that in our attempt to do the socially responsible thing, which is Aquarius, it's actually made people like more isolated from each other, and has made people like more relationship starved, more touch starved, more emotionally unwell. It's brought to the surface a lot of like the feelings of deep unwellness that we've been experiencing as a collective, which I think is very Scorpio. Scorpio, you know, its modern ruler is Pluto. It very much is like, let's get to like what's really going on with people on the inside, what they're really feeling. And that's manifested in a lot of like interesting trends, for lack of a better word. One is that people are very interested in their own like deep psychological emotional profile, including me. Have been, you know, an astrologer for a few years now and really into astrology, because it's kind of what's missing from our collective life is our ability to relate to and connect to and like be just like really with and present with each other. The second manifestation, another shadow side of Scorpio, is that there are these, within our collective, there are these deeply felt feelings, which is Scorpio, our deepest, darkest feelings. Deeply felt feelings of rage, of anger, of frustration, of unmet emotional needs, that have boiled over into real acts of violence, which is, again, a real shadow, real kind of crimes of passion, for lack of a better word, which is a shadow side of Scorpio. And I think our inability to meet all of our material and financial needs, which is Scorpio's opposition to Taurus, our inability to really be together in a real way, because we've been focusing on what's going to kind of advance the larger social project, which is kind of Aquarius, has meant that Scorpio as a missing leg is like coming out in our culture. And that's often what happens with these missing parts of the cross, that they're out of balance, that we're out of whack. And so the most kind of excessive and grotesque and like low resonant version of the sign, like the most monstrous versions of the sign, come out because it's a way of, I think, of our collective trying to put itself back into balance. And if we don't do it in a conscious way, it comes out in these really unconscious ways. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. That's what I have to say about Scorpio as our missing leg. And then ending with Aquarius, which is a fixed air sign, which is kind of oxymoronic. Like, how can air be fixed? And how air is fixed in its Aquarius form, which I think kind of goes to the nature of Aquarius, is that it's security through ideology, right? Through a kind of permanent, fixed, idealized future that we are working toward in the Saturnian sense, because Saturn is traditional ruler of Aquarius, we are working toward as a collective, and that you're connected to other people, not in the Scorpio sense of like, you live with them, you share life with them, you have a lot of deep emotional bonds and ties to them, but you're connected to people because you kind of believe the same things as they do about what the world should be. And that's Aquarius, and that's kind of its fixed air quality. And so that's the fixed cross that I want to talk about, and to talk about kind of what the planets, and when we talked about the planets, in mundane astrology and what they manifest and what they bring into our social conscious awareness in those signs. Saturn that spent 2.5 years there, and now Pluto that's going to move there and spend 20 years there, are bringing to the surface as they express through these signs. So I already kind of talked a bit about this in the last slide when I was going over the 4 fixed signs. But when I think about like squares and these kind of crosses and these intersections, the fixed cross, they naturally, in astrology, they naturally make aspects to each other. They naturally make squares to each other, and they naturally make oppositions. And squares and oppositions are considered difficult aspects. I put difficult quotes. I'm a modern psychological astrologer, so I'm very I have a positivity bias, but I do think that there are low and high resonant versions of everything, and we as humans have agency to make choices and move through the medium that is kind of the cosmos that we're given, and elevate through our own practice, elevate like these aspects and these like archetypes that we're given. Oppositions ask us to balance, to consciously balance the excessive versions of certain signs and certain tendencies that exist in our collective. That when we consciously balance these things, we're able to find high resonant versions of both sides of the opposition. So talking about the signs and their oppositions to each other, we have Taurus opposing Scorpio, which in its low resonant form can struggle with over-dependence versus a hyper-independence. And in its high resonant form, when these opposition is balanced, can look like a healthy understanding of what is mine that I can hold on to for myself versus what can I contribute to the collective pot and trust that I will receive back tenfold. If we look at the opposition of Leo to Aquarius, which is the opposition to the individual versus kind of the community or the collective, in its low resonant form, can be a focus on hyper individualism versus a type of hyper collectivism that really squashes the individual. And in its high resonant form can look like every person, including and especially myself, has a unique gift to offer to the community and to our shared vision. So practically speaking, as we, collectively reflect on these transits of the year, and we start to notice or start to take stock of how these themes that are associated with these planets and associated with these signs start to show up, we have both a conscious relationship to what they mean and what their potentials are, but also what the antidote for the more excessive or the more grotesque or the less conscious and less lower resonant versions are. We're able to say, oh, I see that we're having an excessively Leo kind of energy in our collective. What about Aquarius, its opposite sign, can teach us about how to balance that energy so that we're back into right relationship? Or I see that we're excessively kind of focusing on maybe Taurus and how we don't have enough and how we are unable to kind of get enough of what we need materially, and what can Scorpio in its higher resonant forms about healthy kind of emotional interdependence and really leaning on one another can teach us about how we can move through this moment. And so thinking again about these oppositions and these square relationships as what is crisis really inviting us to consciously step into. So the guiding question, the closing question that I want us to reflect on, meditate on, maybe journal about to end our time together today is, how have the last few years invited us to move through crisis through stabilization? How will that theme, or how is that theme showing up for us this year? So that concludes our time together today. That concludes this video, Intro to Mundane Astrology. Like I said, my name is Mina. If you have thoughts or questions or feedback, please leave it in the comments. I am totally open to hearing them, and yeah, totally excited to share what it is that I've been thinking about and reflecting on with you all today. Bye.